welcome everybody. I am Stefan Underwood, our Vice President of Methodology and Staff Development at Exos, and we have a panel discussion on a great coaching topic here. So I'm joined by two of my colleagues, Shannon Ehrhardt, Registered Dietitian and Certified Strength and Conditioning Specialist. So she's worked in a strength and conditioning role, but now really serves in a nutrition role for Exos, driving a lot of our education and in-facility nutrition practices. So Shannon, thanks for joining. And I got Chris Bertram, Dr. Chris Bertram, although he always tells me not to say doctor, but we've got Chris Bertram, who is a PhD in applied neuroscience. I almost said biomechanics for some reason. That would have thrown us for a loop here. In applied neuroscience. And he sits in a role as a Senior Director of Applied Neuroscience for Exos, helping drive everything to do with brain and body alignment. Chris, thanks for joining us.
Great to be here.
All right, so we've got an interesting conversation today. I think it's one that represents a big development over the last few years. And it's around the use of cannabis in sports and CBD coming into research lately. And look, at the end of the day, we probably need to start with a few caveats. First and foremost, we're talking about something in the United States is still federally illegal. We're talking about something that is still on many banned substance lists. And so it is any coach out there listening, it is your responsibility to know 100% where things sit for the athlete you're working with from a legal standpoint, and from a banned substance list in their particular sport. Like, have to throw out that caveat. And I'll also say, while we're going to talk about the topic, Exos is not currently recommending that any of our athletes use cannabis. Like, Shannon isn't sitting there in the facilities recommending cannabis to athletes. So I just want to be very clear up front with that. But it's a conversation we've been having more and more, because I think the reality is a lot of athletes utilize cannabis. And it's something that as coaches, we need to be armed to be able to have a conversation around this, right? Because since about late 2020, I think 15 US states and the entire country of Canada, where Chris and I actually sit, have legalized cannabis for adults. In addition to that, some sport bodies are starting to remove it from banned substances lists. MLB is the biggest example of that. So cannabis, like THC itself, the psychoactive element, is no longer a banned substance in Major League Baseball. And many of those athletes may be living in places where it is legal. And so the reality is, you may, as a coach, be asked some questions, and you've got to be armed with how to answer them. So that's what we're going to have, is a very honest, factual conversation today of what the research does and does not currently represent. And really, it's no different to alcohol. A coach needs to be armed to have a conversation with athletes on the effects of alcohol and performance. The interesting thing is, and we'll get to this at the end, is I'd say alcohol, pretty much all of the effects are detrimental. With CBD and cannabis, there's starting to be some interesting research where maybe it's not all negative. So maybe there are some positive impacts as well. And that's what we want to get into. So those are my caveats up front. Shannon, Chris, you guys ready to dive in?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. So look, the first conversation I want to have is what exactly we're talking about, right? Like, there's THC, a psychoactive element. There's CBD. These are ultimately things that are affecting our endocannabinoid system. So what is that? What does that consist of? And so, Shannon, I want to come over to you first and basically say, what are we talking about today? When you say cannabis or THC or CBD or marijuana, these different words, what refers to what, and what are we talking about?
Yeah, for sure. It's definitely important to understand the system that we're trying to impact here. And when we say THC, when we say CBD, those are cannabinoids, and they have an impact on the endocannabinoid system. What is that system? The system it's a cell signaling system. You know, there's receptors that are proteins that, when they become activated by certain endocannabinoids, which are naturally occurring in the body, or by cannabinoids like THC, CBD. Once those proteins are, activated, those cell receptors, they determine the signal that an additional signal that should be activated or inhibited. And there are what we do know right now is that there are CBD or CB1 and CB2 receptors, and they're found all over the body. And right now we know that CB1 receptors are primarily found in the brain and central nervous system. And CB2 receptors are mostly found in the peripheral organs, especially the cells of the immune system. And so the way that cannabinoids interact with these receptors, it varies. And so we can dive a little bit into that as well if we want. But that's kind of what the primary function of the endocannabinoid system is, to maintain homeostasis, right? So we don't want anything to get too out of whack. So that system is meant to kind of bring things back into kind of one system, homeostasis.
Yeah, awesome. And so within that system, if we're talking centrally and peripherally, and I'm sure, Chris, you're in your line of study really interested in that central element, especially. But when we talk THC psychoactive, CBD not, THC illegal in some areas, CBD, I believe, legal everywhere, right? Nothing psychoactive about CBD. Chris, how would you break down a little bit more about what we're talking about when we reference CBD versus THC, or anything else that you'd add about the system, what we're talking about?
Yeah, I think Shannon did a great job covering it there. I think the point to highlight is when we're talking about the effect of certain cannabinoids, whether that be THC, CBD, or any of the 80 to 100 that can occur in the cannabis plant, or others that we have naturally occurring within us, it really depends on where those receptors are to determine what the effect is going to be. So as Shannon talked about, some of the receptors for THC, for example, exist in the central nervous system, the brain and spinal cord. Others exist in the periphery. And so when we start to get into, well, what are the effects of these cannabinoids? It depends specifically on where the receptors are and what happens downstream once one of these molecules latches on to one of these receptors.
Yeah, okay. And so when you talk about some of our natural, the endocannabinoids or endogenous cannabinoids, that'd be like, you talk about flow a lot. We know in the flow cocktail, like anandamide is one of them. That is a cannabinoid, correct?
Right. That's part of our natural endocannabinoid system. We do have receptors that are naturally occurring within our brains and our bodies, because we have these natural molecules that our body produces. And one of them, yes, as you mentioned, is part of the recipe and the neurochemical cocktail that shows up in flow in this thing called anandamide, which is, you look it up, it shows up as the bliss molecule. So it is a component of the flow experience. But again, that's sort of that's in that internal endocannabinoid system.
Yeah, perfect. No, I think it's great to discuss, because one of the interesting ones I find is a little bit of stigma that's around things. I remember not that long ago, and I believe you were involved as a co-author on it, Shannon, but we had an article with position statement that we were looking to put out on CBD, fully legal, not psychoactive. Yet there was this stigma. And I remember our marketing team having some push on that, saying, let's hold on putting that out there yet, because CBD would be automatically associated with THC. And there was this negative stigma where, Shannon, is there any reason, at least around CBD, is it fair to say we should remove all stigma there? That is CBD in any way different to any other supplement that you may look at with an athlete, from a legality standpoint, safety standpoint, anything like that? Or, what's your take on that?
There's definitely some some education that needs to go into it, just like any other supplement, right? So like the supplement industry as a whole is not regulated to the standard that it should be. And so educating athletes on supplement safety is always a priority. And CBD falls under that category as a supplement. So education is key. I definitely think that there's, a time and a place for CBD based on the research that we've seen come out. And that's how I base any recommendations on, is based on research, not just, it's a fad thing or it's a hot new topic or whatever. Let's look at some of the research first and determine whether it could be a part of your protocol or whatever that might be.
Yeah, absolutely. So that probably segues us perfectly in. Oh, were you going to add something, Chris?
I was just going to say there are some maybe notable differences and considerations when it comes to CBD, particularly in the United States, right? I mean, it is now legal to grow hemp, which has a very specific definition, has about like 0.3% THC per pound. And that is where you can legally source CBD now. But the problem there is that how it gets, how it gets synthesized, how it gets productized downstream is not federally regulated, because it is still federally illegal to have certain of these plants grown. There is no federal oversight over what is happening, who's doing the extraction, and what's showing up in these products. So there is a reason to keep an eye out for where you're sourcing your products, and keeping an eye on the fact that even hemp, by definition, still has a component of THC in it. So if we're talking about anti-doping and that sort of thing, those are issues that we need to be eyes wide open on.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up. Actually, I realized that as I had made my statement of, is there any difference? That's something that we were talking about just the other day, right? And Shannon, you have heard situations of athletes from CBD failing a drug test still, right? There, because we don't know the right dose amount for CBD at times, and they may take a lot, and there is still trace amounts. And so that is something, again, that we need to be really aware of and cognizant of, is the sport the individual's playing, what the banned substance list of that sport is. And if THC is a banned substance, you need to know that there is a possibility with CBD that there still is some THC in the system. Correct, Shannon?
Yeah, definitely. And that's a whole part of the education that, we talk about, is if somebody wants to utilize CBD for, pain management or whatever that might be, it's definitely a conversation, because even though it's, 0.3%, per pound or whatever, if your dose that you have to take is really high compared to what somebody else might take, you could still test positive for THC in your system, because even though, it says non-detectable or it's below this certain amount, you're still getting a small amount of it. And that's the truth. If you're not, then it could be a unsafe product where the company's just creating synthetic, CBD. And now we're talking about a whole host of other issues that we could run into. So, yeah.
Right. So again, I think that comes back to the caveats at the top. If you're looking at working with general populations, CBD may have some really interesting things that we'll get into here in this conversation for you with your clients. If you're working with athletes, you've got to be aware of anti-doping laws, regulations within that sport, even for CBD, let alone THC. And again, like I said, they're all different. At the top, I mentioned MLB is completely removed, even THC. So something to know. And again, federal, state laws, there's a lot to unpack here. But again, I think the reason we're having this conversation is because the reality is it's relevant to the field. So even if it may be controversial in some areas, it is relevant to the field. We know that it is something that clients may be asking us about. And as coaches, dietitians, physical therapists, I think there's a responsibility to be knowledgeable at least a little bit. So let's jump into that. So there is let's talk about potential negative impacts. There is no known toxicity in terms of, you cannot die from even THC. You can't overdose on THC, which even when you look at other things like vitamin C, or even when you look at alcohol, right? You have 3 drinks, it's fine. You go have 30, that's a problem. With THC, Chris, you were talking about this the other day. Is it fair to say there's no known toxicity for THC, correct?
Well, so the way they figure this out, there's a statistic that they'll use called the LD50, which is the lethal dose that it would take of a given chemical or molecule to kill 50% of the mice or the lab rats that they tested on. And that number, there's a real number there for alcohol and for Tylenol and for any other thing that the FDA has oversight on in the United States, right? And the number that they've come up with, they have not figured out what the LD50 is, or the toxic lethal dose for human beings. They've managed to figure it out in mice, but they've sort of done the calculation on what that would actually translate to in the human population. And it would be something like smoking 1,500 pounds of marijuana inside 15 minutes. So you'd probably die of carbon monoxide poisoning long before the THC got to you. Point is it's not toxic per se. It's not that there aren't dangers to it, particularly on the mode of delivery. There is a crisis out there with people vaping THC and cannabis. That has more to do with some of the other chemicals that are in there, they believe, not necessarily the cannabis per se. It's the mode of delivery. But yeah, generally speaking, compared to other things that we can get over the counter very readily, the toxicity is excessively low.
So that's great to know. And so it brings us to our first point of a potentially negative impact, that you should be armed as again, coach, dietitian, physical therapist, anyone engaging with an athlete or a client. The type of consumption matters. You can't just say we're having a conversation about THC or CBD. The type of consumption matters, because I would ascertain as a strength coach, smoking anything is not good for performance, right? Like putting smoke in my lungs is not good. And you bring up vaping. I mean, chemicals, poison, like there is a real risk with vaping. So mode of delivery is one of the first potential impacts to have a conversation around your clients with, right? Of that mode of consumption, be it an edible, be it smoking, be it vaping. That's a fair statement for negative impact potentially, right?
Absolutely, yes.
Now, what about, Chris, I remember in Canada, when Canada was legalizing it, there were a lot of conversations about what the age of consumption would be. And I'll say, unfortunately, they just went with the same as, alcohol, I believe. Mm-hmm. But there's a lot of research on, we know that the brain is not done developing until about 25. Insurance companies know this, car companies know this. It's why young drivers pay more in insurance. And it's why you can't rent a car till you're 25. The frontal lobes, executive function, decision-making parts of the brain are not done developing yet. Any risk with, when you start talking about potential impacts, does the age of the individual play in at all? The age of the athlete? Is there a difference between a 20-year-old athlete and a 21-year-old athlete, stay within legal, and a 31-year-old athlete in your mind?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I looked around for data on this, and there really isn't a lot on, what is that cause and effect if you're consuming cannabis, THC, before the age of 25. And there really doesn't seem to be anything that's well documented. But I think as a best practice, the things we do know is that the human brain is not fully wired up and fully developed until about the age of 25. And so I think it's prudent at that point to err on the side of caution and just say, why would we be tinkering around with that neurochemistry in a system that is not fully developed yet? And so if I was thinking about this, no matter who I was talking to or what the use, whether it's THC, CBD, or some combination thereof, I think 25 should be a reasonable point where we just say, you know what, that's a hard stop. Anything before that, it's not going to be in the best interest. I think until we know more, that is the prudent decision to make.
Yeah. And I think that's great. And even outside of 25, you talk about this natural system, this brilliant system we have, this endocannabinoid system that's so critical for performance and function. Even outside of the developing mind, is there any risk of potential negative impact around the amount or the habitual nature to which consumption might take place? And whether this is opinion or backed up by research, but just when we talk about, is there a chance of disrupting a natural system, much like exogenous melatonin? Like if I become really reliant on melatonin every single night, does my body stop producing the same amount of melatonin? Is there something like that?
Yeah, I mean, we don't have a lot of good data on that specifically, but I think there are cautions that come from other places, like the one you just mentioned. If you're taking a lot of exogenous melatonin as a sleep aid, let's say, there is demonstrated decreases in the natural secretion of melatonin from your pineal gland in your brain, because there's all of it, you're putting it in your body, it's floating around. Your brain just says, well, I guess I don't really need to be doing that anymore. I don't need to be producing that chemical or releasing it in the way that you might otherwise do. I think whenever we start to talk about habitually replacing endogenous chemicals with exogenous molecules, that risk is always going to be present. And again, there's not really good data on this, but I think it's certainly something to be keeping in mind.
Yeah, Shannon, do you have any take on that? I mean, obviously, the world of dietetics goes far beyond supplements, but obviously there is a high degree of external compounds that dietitians give to athletes and clients, right? And so, like, what's your take on right amounts and not disrupting natural systems, be it melatonin or in this scenario we're talking about the endocannabinoid system?
Yeah, for me, I'm always, suggesting, to cycle, no matter what the supplement is, and because it's just, we don't know a lot about chronic use of whatever it is, a multivitamin or, CBD specifically. I know I've heard of a lot of people hitting their tolerance, and they just don't feel the same effect. And so they have to increase their dose. And so there's times where I'm like, just take a break, find your dose. I'm talking specifically for, CBD, like find your most effective dose, and utilize that. And once you kind of like stop feeling those effects, like maybe just take a break from it, as opposed to keep increasing. One other thing I wanted to touch on, when we're talking about like negative effects and like tying into like safety again, is I think it's really important to mention the certificate of analysis when we're talking about like hemp specifically. So just like any sort of like third party like testing, negative side effects like toxic chemicals, things like that, like this certificate of analysis, if you're buying a quality product, they're going to have this, and it's a report of that batch, and it tells you pesticides, heavy metals, other toxic chemicals, if they've been detected. It'll tell you the level of THC and CBD in them, and any other like potential terpenes or whatever that might be. And so if you're trying to find a quality product, like you ask the company if it's not already like there for you, ask the company for this certificate of analysis, and you're checking your safety box, and exactly what's in that product. And so especially if you're working with an athlete who needs to know THC levels and stuff like that.
Yeah, so that was actually going to be my question: is how do you go about finding certificate analysis? Just some companies, and I think we're mostly talking about CBD here, right? But most companies will have them available. But if you can't, reach out to the company and ask, say, can I please see your certificate of analysis? Is it something that they are required by law to have, or is it one of those that just if they don't have it, that's a giant red flag in and of itself?
Absolutely, yeah. And so we talk about not having side effects or negative impacts, like things like that. Like if you feel like you're having a side effect from just like a CBD product, that's probably not the CBD itself, it's the other like potential chemicals that are in the product. If the company should have a certificate of analysis, like right there on their website. If they don't, you can call them, and if they have one, they have to send it to you. And if they don't have one, then I would just move on and
just don't buy their product.
Yeah, don't even bother.
No, that's good, because is it a new enough industry that, and like we always talk about third-party certification, and NSF certified for sport is our company's stance on supplements, right? Like if I say, Shannon, I want to take a protein, I want to take this protein, what do you think? Instead of just pushing whoever we're partnered with at the time, the first thing you'd ask me, true or false, is, well, let's take a look at that and look, is it NSF certified for sport, correct?
Yeah.
CBD though,
yep.
CBD though, are there NSF certified for sport CBD products, or is it too new for that? And so this certificate of analysis replaces that as a sort of check.
Yeah, it doesn't, the certificate of analysis doesn't like deem it like okay for sport, right? It doesn't say okay, as long as it has a certificate, then you're good to go, and you're not going to test positive for THC at all, because we still have to think about the dosing issues, right? So that certificate of analysis just tells you exactly what's in the product. So it is the third party testing, but it's not like a certified for sport testing. It's a quality product third party testing, and we'll tell you like if there's other toxic chemicals and what the levels are of those things.
Perfect. No, I appreciate it, because it is new and it is still very, very unregulated. Like, let alone the fact of how unregulated supplements are in general. It feels like this is even more unregulated, even more emergent right now, and especially in the U.S. where, Chris, I think you've talked about, like, it is federally illegal. I think 15 states say it's legal, but now, like, even if I'm on the interstate in a state where it's legal, I think that's illegal. I think that if you're in Arizona and you go to California, both states where it's legal, and you cross over state boundary, I think you just committed a federal, like a felony, like a serious crime. So it's things for athletes to know, right? Like, yeah, can you talk about the regulation a little bit?
Just super complicated. I mean, in the United States, the regulatory body to ensure safety, effectiveness, efficacy of any product is the FDA. And when you've got this larger community of cannabis products. Some states have it legalized, some states don't. It's now legalized to have hemp grown everywhere and to be distilling CBD from that. But there's no federal oversight over safety, effectiveness, and efficacy. So that is a cause for concern. It's then left up to the individual states to determine, is this a safe product? Does it work? Does it work for what it say it's going to do in the masses? So it's a bit of the Wild West here still. And I think, to that point, I think all of the points Shannon just made around, making sure you're checking those certificates for purity and getting what you think you're getting, that's the next best thing here.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I mean, without getting political and not stating an opinion in any way, but just with as many states making it legal, some sports bodies taking off banned substance lists, it almost feels like it would be a step forward for federally for it to be legal. Because what's interesting is supplements are not food nor drug. Therefore, the FDA do not have oversight over them. Correct, Shannon? Or is that an incorrect statement? Yeah. Whereas this is a drug, THC. And so presumably if it was legal everywhere, the FDA would have to step in and would have to guarantee some just like Tylenol, just like Advil, or anything else that is a food or a drug, right?
If your concern is safety and effectiveness and efficacy, then absolutely, I think having it legalized so that you could have some federal oversight over the products themselves, I think that would be a worthwhile step.
That's interesting. So we've talked about, just to recap, like right out of the gate, things that we've got to be able to warn athletes of and have conversations. It doesn't mean that it's automatically going to curb them, but you guys have talked about the type of consumption. So there can be absolutely risk to talk about with smoking or vaping. We want to talk about those younger athletes, that under 25, the developing brain. You've talked about that. And while there isn't strong research there is sort of some common sense on let's not tinker too much with natural systems that are still being developed. We've talked about it is very unregulated and still federally illegal in the US. So there may be legal repercussions for the athlete. We've talked about looking for that certificate of analysis to at least try and make sure what you're getting is of a higher quality. It does not mean guaranteed that you will not fail a drug test still, even for CBD, because there are trace amounts, but at least know you're getting a good product. And then you've talked about not wanting to disrupt, again, that natural system. So looking at habitual use versus periodic use. I feel like there's one other thing on the list that we've talked about before. Chris, you've talked about before, potential impacts when we pull like CBD and THC on sleep. And CBD, like some appear to have some potential positive benefits, but some appear to have some potential negative. So maybe it's not a negative impact or a positive impact, but can you talk about whether that's a separate conversation, THC and CBD, or the two together, wherever you need to take that. But can you talk about sleep and
Sure.
these compounds?
Yeah, well, obviously, sleep is a super relevant topic for any athlete and any person, any human being. And there certainly is a bit of an arms race out there to find products that can help enhance sleep. And cannabis, CBD, THC have all been touted for their benefits on sleep. And there is some data on this now, which I think is really interesting. So, if you look at usually in the natural form, if you're smoking marijuana, cannabis, you're going to get THC and CBD. And the data on that suggests that even though those two in combination can help bring on a state of sleep, you can help you become unconscious and move you towards sleep. It turns out now that we know pretty definitively that THC has a very selective and negative impact on the sleep architecture, specifically on REM sleep. And we know that REM sleep is very, very important for, emotional regulation. It's very important for learning long term. And so even though THC can help, put you into a state of sleep, you're not actually having naturalistic sleep. This is very much akin to alcohol conversation. Alcohol is a sedative. It can help you get to sleep, but then disrupts the architecture. And the same thing there too, actually disrupts REM sleep very specifically. At least on the broad, this is what seems to be showing up. And so, as a tool to enhance sleep, that's something to be very considerate of. CBD, on the other hand, in isolation, does seem to have a very nice effect both on falling asleep and on the quality of sleep. So CBD as an isolated molecule now in the conversation of sleep does seem to be beneficial and not disruptive to the architecture of sleep.
That's fascinating. Like you said, a bit of an arms race on how to optimize sleep going on. But again, I think interesting to know, and an interesting parallel to alcohol, right? Like alcohol is going to disrupt sleep, and specifically REM sleep, and to know that THC may be doing the same thing, again, becomes a pertinent conversation to athletes who are looking to recover optimally, and knowing that while it may move them, as you said, to a state of unconsciousness, that does not mean that the quality of that sleep is valuable. So I want to shift gears. So that brings us to, that was a little bit of an in-between, like CBD may be positive, like not talking about positive impact or negative impact, but are there other known impacts that could be positive or negative based on context? If I think of, I think of a couple, but I think you talked previously about THC and appetite, context dependent, that could be good or bad. Anxiety is one that we hear a lot about. I feel like any conversation you get into around CBD or THC, anxiety and depression seem to be brought up. Shannon, what's your take on THC and appetite? Is there truth to that there is it triggers an increase in appetite, or is that placebo? Is that not true? What's the role of THC and appetite, and when is that positive? When's that negative?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's definitely some research, and maybe Chris can talk more specifically about it, but there's definitely some research suggesting that it does have a positive impact on appetite. And so if there's obviously when we're talking about chemo or a cancer patient or something who can't eat but needs to eat because there's so much trauma going on within internally, they need to eat. Right. So that could be a place for, THC to help with appetite. I've, potentially athletes that, if it's an appropriate area, it's not something I've ever recommended. Let me just make that
right.
clear, is that but I have heard stories of athletes using THC just to keep their appetite up, because they're just putting so much demand on their body that sometimes their appetite drops, and they have used it for just to increase appetite there in that area. Again, I never recommended that, but so there's definitely situations where it can be useful. Obviously, if somebody is trying to lose weight, it's not something that would be beneficial for that person. So
a bag of potato chips and a joint is a bad idea for that person. Yeah.
Yes.
No, absolutely.
I'll back up Shannon there. And again, this gets back to the conversation we were having at the beginning. It's not a placebo. This is real. It depends on where the receptors are. And you have CB1 receptors in your brain in the centers that are responsible for appetite and nausea. And so when THC latches onto those receptors in those areas, it stimulates them, which stimulates appetite and can be, help suppress feelings of nausea that certain clinical patients can really benefit from. That's a real thing. So context matters here.
Absolutely. Yeah. Getting away from our conversation around athletes and speaking to, like you said, that cancer patient going through chemo, some very real things to look at potentially. Right. Fantastic. Chris, can you talk about the other one I brought up that I've heard a lot on is just anxiety and depression, or just mood or state. THC, CBD, either one, both together, positive, negative impact?
Yeah.
How does it influence that?
So yeah, I mean, I think on the subject of, the effect of THC and CBD in combination, or, either in isolation, I think there's some good evidence to suggest that THC and CBD together in the form of marijuana can be known and can have a demonstrated effect on anxiety, can decrease anxiety. So that's a real effect. There's also some great data that shows that just CBD in isolation can have a nice effect on the suppression of anxiety, which is nice. I mean, when it comes to, the athlete population, obviously that's, dealing with anxiety around competition and performance is a real issue. And so there is some demonstrated effect that CBD in isolation, and CBD in combination with THC can have an effect there.
A positive effect of decreasing anxiety.
Positive effect, yes.
Yeah.
Look, this is very much, the conversation around THC by itself, depending on who you are and what your relationship is. Certainly THC can be anxiety inducing depending on your familiarity with it. It can go either way on that one, but there are reports of people who use THC and CBD in combination as a way to suppress anxiety. So again, this is kind of, it depends on the person, the time, and the place, and the setting, but that one can potentially go either way if you're just talking about THC.
Absolutely. Are there any, a question to either of you, are there any other potential positive impacts, either known or promising in the research of either THC or CBD that you're keeping an eye on?
I think that there's a lot of promising research in utilizing CBD alone, but also in combination with THC as part of a pain management program. And so, we know that these CB receptors are found all over the body. CB2 receptors specifically, can interact with the cells in the immune system. And so, just supporting that endocannabinoid system in functioning properly and supporting the immune system, there's been some positive effects on just controlling pain and that sort of stuff, and just in recovery in general. So no matter kind of who you are, whether you're recovering from surgery or an injury, or pain management, if you're going through chemo or something like that, pain management is an area that I'm keeping an eye on personally.
Yeah, I think that's probably the key one there. And I think, this is where the conversation around THC and CBD gets really interesting, right? Because pain is sort of a two-step process. You've got the actual site of, injury, let's say, and there's inflammation there that causes pain, but pain ultimately gets perceived up in your brain. And so THC latches onto those CB1 receptors in the brain, and they can decrease your perception of pain regardless of what's happening peripherally. But those CB2 receptors that Shannon was talking about can actually have a direct impact on the inflammation itself. So you get this double-pronged attack on pain. One is that the actual site of inflammation, which can be the source of pain, can be influenced by THC and CBD. But then when it comes to the perception of the pain in the brain, that's where THC really is your only avenue, because that's the only molecule that latches onto that CB1 receptor in the certain parts of the brain that perceive pain in the first place. So I think that's a really interesting area to think about, and certainly we need more research there. The only other ones I was going to say, in terms of athletic performance, what do we know about THC and CBD there? And there's not a lot of, it's really unclear at this point. If you look at the physiological effect of, smoking cannabis, the data there is pretty unconvincing, I would say. There is some reason to believe, there are data that I was looking at just this morning that show, in terms of your aerobic output, if you're getting on a cycle ergometer or something, and one group's had some THC and CBD in the system, the other hasn't, your ability to produce aerobic work, is decreased. But again, that was smoking, right? So that in and of itself could have been a confound to that result. But if you look at grip strength and your ability to do anaerobic work, there doesn't seem to be an effect either way there. So it's pretty neutral. It's not increasing, it doesn't seem to be decreasing it. So what's the point? But then the psychological impact is sort of the area of real interest here. And this gets back to a little bit to that anxiety conversation. If we can reduce anxiety in a meaningful way, maybe that shows up in all kinds of interesting areas of performance outcomes. So there's still a lot of work to be done there. I think the conversations have to be around the method of delivery, how much of each of these things, or even in isolation, what's the dose? What's the dose response? I mean, we just don't know these things yet. There's a lot of research that's coming out recently on this that I think will help elucidate some of that, but still really unclear.
I appreciate that so much. So look, if we wrap up, and I'll have one final question, but we wrap up, I definitely appreciate what you guys have taken us through and this idea of understanding the endocannabinoid system a little bit, CB1 and CB2 receptors, central and peripheral impacts of those, and THC and CBD simply being exogenous compounds from a naturally occurring plant that influence that cannabinoid system and bind those CB1, CB2 receptors. I appreciate very much that while there's no known toxicity, you laid out the things that anyone where an athlete comes up and says, hey, let me ask you about this. Things tell them whether it convinces the athlete or not, to understand type of consumption matters and risk around smoking and vaping, or I should say decreased performance potential around smoking and risk around vaping. Or I guess I'll stay risk on smoking if you look at long-term health impacts. It's just not good to put smoke in your lungs, right? You've talked about the under 25 developing brain. You've talked about how unregulated it is, getting a certificate of analysis. You've talked about how it may disrupt the natural system if it's habitual use versus periodic use. And you've talked about a potential disruption of THC on REM sleep. But as that got into some interesting things to look at of potential positive use cases, CBD alone, or looking at a potential positive impact on sleep, a neutral based on context, good or bad, but an increase on appetite is noted. And you talked about influence and anxiety. And so performance anxiety, which Chris, I thought you just summed up that last piece really eloquently of there's not really a physical performance benefit to doing anything here, but there's something that you're keeping an eye on psychologically. Performance anxiety is obviously very real. From there, looking at pain, I think that's a great call out, Shannon. That's the overview of, I appreciate you guys coming on and taking something that quite often has a lot of stigma around it and having just a very open, honest, and real conversation without opinion, unbiased, because the reality is it is something that coaches should be armed to be able to discuss with athletes if the athlete asks a question. It's something like alcohol. It is happening. You need to understand how to come with a very neutral statement around the use of it. But I want to go back to the very, very start. We had caveats. We had caveats of understanding local laws, federal laws, sport governing body laws, and anti-doping laws, even with CBD, where it could have trace amounts and lead to a failed drug test. These are critical things to keep an eye on. And for that reason, Shannon, I just want to come to you, and I want us to end by being very clear on Exos's stance and what we are and aren't doing and recommending in facilities. I appreciate you've come on and you've brought just, here's a presentation of research and here is, let's frame up the conversation as relevant. But when it comes to where we currently are in our facilities, am I correct, Shannon, in that we are not, even if it's legal in the sport and even if it's legal in the state, we are not recommending THC to any athlete, correct?
No, absolutely not. There's just too many unknowns right now.
Appreciate that. So just to be very clear. And then when it comes to CBD, are we recommending that to any athletes, or are we also still not currently actively recommending that?
We're not currently actively recommending, but it's definitely a conversation that has come up a lot more around recovery and pain. And as we continue to watch regulations and the research that's coming out, that door becomes a little bit more and more open. But as of right now, none of our dietitians are directly recommending, CBD. We're just having educated conversations with our athletes.
Perfect. And that's just where I wanted to end this, is for everybody to know we are not actively supporting use of or saying being against use of. We are today, the point was to have a very neutral, a very ethically neutral conversation around the research of these compounds. That's it. We are not actively recommending the use of THC or CBD to any of the clients we work with, but we are armed to have conversations. So if the athlete steps into Shannon's office asking questions, she is prepared to answer those questions for the athlete versus saying, I don't know. So with that, I want to wrap us up. I think we're up on time. I know I've learned some things and I really appreciate that. Shannon, thank you so much for taking time to join me. Chris, same to you. I really enjoyed this conversation and thank you both.
Yeah,
anytime.
Fun.
All right. We will we'll catch everybody on another future panel. We've also got our live Exos Live coaching Q&As, so people can come on, talk to a panel and ask questions of dietitians, physical therapists, strength coaches for Exos. So stay tuned for that. We're just excited to be having a conversation with everybody. On that note, we'll end there. Thank you all.